your marriage can be anything that you want it to be. You don't have to just follow a supplied script.
Wayne Scott is a writer, psychotherapist, and teacher in Portland, Oregon. His writing has appeared in The Sun, Poets and Writers, The Psychotherapy Networker, Huffington Post, and The Oregonian. He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to discuss his memoir, The Maps They Gave Us. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Wayne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Wayne, I'm excited to have you here. I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
My story as an author, well, I mean, I guess there's two answers to that. I first started writing when I was actually a little boy. I was like a serious, obsessive worrier when I was growing up, and my grandmother offered me the idea that if I journaled, if I put my worries down into some place, that would be that would be a way of containing it. And it actually ended up being something that worked. And so I was a pretty hardcore journal keeper throughout my teenage years and young adulthood. Then that just kind of transitioned very naturally into writing essays, personal, with a very personal voice, personal essays. And then the book is a sort of, I brought together all the essays I had ever written about marriage, and I kind of lined them up chronologically and realized, oh, actually, if I just built a few bridges here and there, I could have a memoir, I could have a book length piece about marriage.
Yeah, well, I'm curious to dig into that, but before I do, what were you so worried about as a kid?
Well, I grew up. I was a little kid during the 70s, and so there was still a draft during the 70s, and so I worried obsessively about getting drafted. I used to stay up at night listening to the radio. The radio in those days in the 70s, one of the big features in the news was the death counts, how many soldiers we had lost in Vietnam that day or that week. And so that is not great stuff for a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boy to be listening to before he goes to bed. And then the other, I think the big obsession was the Cold War was really big at that time. So, it was the apocalyptic theme of the era was Vietnam and the Cold War.
Yeah, and then like 10 years later, like into the 80s, which is when kind of when I was growing up, all of the movies were coming out about the Vietnam War and the Cold War. Like it kind of fueled, I guess, some kind of creativity into my coming of age anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so let's dive into the memoir, The Maps They Gave Us, and your essays that kind of built it. In terms of essays on marriage, what was just give me a sense of what it's all about.
Yeah. So my spouse and I have been together for over 3 decades, and we are in what is called what psychologists term a mixed orientation marriage, which means that she is straight and I am not. And from the very beginning of our relationship, I identified as a bisexual guy, and then later as time passed and the word queer kind of came into vogue, then as a queer guy. And it's kind of how we navigated this heteronormative container that we had been given when we first got married, which emphasized kind of traditional vows, traditional kind of conventions of how people were to be together, how we then transitioned into a creative marital arrangement that fit us better, that included non-monogamy. So it's really very focused on the transition, the very messy, painful transition from monogamy to non-monogamy.
So going back to the early stages of that relationship, over 30 years ago, did she always know this about you? I mean, was this something that you kept secret from her, or was it like upfront and on the table early on?
Yeah, no secret. I mean, we went to college together in Chicago, and when I first asked her out on a date, she went to one of our mutual friends and said, why is this gay guy asking me out on a date? Because that is kind of how I was perceived on our campus. I was pretty active, pretty involved in LGBTQ politics and things like that. But I was also I did behaviorally identify as bisexual. It's just at that time, this is like the darkest kind of part of the AIDS pandemic. You really didn't easily append the word bisexual to your identity. Like it was just not an acceptable word. It was a word that that people were a little suspicious about. The bisexual men were seen as the people who were going to carry the virus from the gay community to the straight community. And so nobody used that term easily. It had a lot of stigma attached to it. So, but if you look behaviorally, like it would have fit me at the time. That's what I was. So that's what we were when we first. And I think the other big influence on who we were when we were coming together in the late '80s was kind of third wave feminism for my spouse, and a lot of women really wanting to be with different kinds of men, not wanting to be with men who that necessarily fit into a very kind of straight mold of the typical ways that straight men behave. And so I think that she was kind of open and interested in something different.
Right. But even like this idea of non-monogamy, was that something sort of in the zeitgeist at the time, or was it something that like, you faced some friction with?
Well, it's interesting. Within the queer community at that time, definitely it was kind of the norm, at least amongst queer men that I hung out with. Nobody ever talked about monogamy, so non-monogamy was very much in my framework. But when I was transitioning into the relationship with the girlfriend who became my wife, she pretty early on insisted that if we were going to be close, physically close, that we had to be monogamous. And I had been through so much at that time related to the AIDS pandemic, in terms of HIV scares and stuff like that. Then when she first suggested monogamy, like I was really grateful. Like I was like, oh man, that would be like the port in the storm. That would be like that would like because no guys I'd ever been with had ever suggested that as an option.
Right,
Um,
because we're not wired that way. I mean, it's like
yeah, I know.
if
So
we
I
can
was
get
just
away without if we can get away without it, I think a lot of people would.
in another historical period, maybe it would have been felt like she was rushing me, or it was a restriction, or it was too soon. But honestly, after everything I'd been through at that point, this is like I would have been in my mid 20s at this point. I was grateful. I was like, what a good idea. That would be like great. Never heard of that. Tell me about this monogamy you're talking about. So
Right. Right. So, I mean, that was sort of where, the sort of maybe compromise or decision that you made as a couple. But at some point, does that unravel?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, once, even when you kind of see yourself as somewhat radical or as a convention breaker, that kind of thing, the longer you're together as a heterosexual couple, at least for us, and then you move into the marriage years, because we did decide to get formally married, the conventions kind of overtake you, right? And I remember, when we decided to get married and we were meeting with the Episcopalian priest who was going to do the ceremony, he said, we put together our own little creative vows, which is what people did at that time, and I think they still do it. And he was like, "Yeah, these are cute, but you gotta mention God, and you got to mention fidelity." We didn't have either of those in our vows, and so, but there wasn't really a conversation about it. Like, well, what would fidelity mean for a bisexual guy? There wasn't a conversation. It was just like, no, this has to be in there. It's actually not a conversation. You just have to do it. And I what do you know when you're in your 20s? I was very much in love. She felt very safe for me. I really felt like I had kind of won the lottery, and so I did kind of make that commitment, hoping it would just be okay, and that she would be enough. And for a long time she was. For a long time she was, and then about the 15-year mark is where things kind of came undone, and I realized I was too much missing the queer community, queer men, my connections with men. It was just, desire changes over time, people's bodies change, and the container we were in didn't really allow for that kind of growth or adaptation.
So, is there a discussion at that period of time, or is it just a sort of a general sort of falling apart a little bit, or what was the dynamic?
Yeah, I wish there'd been a conversation, but we had a crisis instead. um, because I had, I'm not really proud of this, but I mean, I had been sort of like looking at connecting with men through various back hallways of the internet. Um, and she discovered that, and that's what kind of brought everything to a crisis. And we separated. We thought we were going to divorce because that's kind of part of the script. If you don't have a good marriage, you have to get divorced. Um, and uh, and so there was this long, and the book the period that's captured in the memoir is that very painful liminal period between, the crisis and thinking you're going to get divorced and then figuring out what you're ultimately going to do. And we were in we had sought out the counsel of a professional who did both couples counseling and divorce mediation. And so she worked with us over the course of a year. She's actually a big character in the memoir. Um, and yeah, but we never defined what we were doing. We never solidly defined that it was mediation or couples counseling. And so she just kind of kept us in this liminal period. And then at a certain point, about 6 months in, she said, you guys seem like you're pretty together. You seem like you're pretty committed to each other. Have you ever thought about having an open arrangement? And we were just shell shocked that she could even make such a suggestion. I thought she was breaking a rule to suggest such a thing. Like, she's a professional, she's a licensed professional. They're not supposed to say things like that. Um, and she just basically said, I have lots of couples that do this, and if you decide that you want to make it work, you can make it work. Your marriage can be anything that you want it to be. You don't have to just follow a supplied script.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a fair amount to unpack there, but the one thing that I'm fascinated with is, I mean, this counselor, she is vertically integrated. I mean, she on one side she is the couples counselor, on the other side she's a mediator. I mean, that's a good business model, I think. Number one, but
Right.
but number two, it's this idea of conversation over crisis, and I
uh,
think a lot of couples. I mean, I can't speak from a ton of experience or even academic knowledge, but it's reasonable to believe that a lot of people only start having those conversations after there's been some kind of a crisis, and
yeah.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you why it was in my case. Because of the way we had constructed our vows, because of the way in which we were kind of locked in, it was fidelity or nothing. Um, and I mean that was both my spouse's desire, because that meant safety to her, but also, I mean, it was we signed up. The vows are pretty strict that you take, and we got them from a priest, and he had a lot of authority in our lives, um, and so to initiate any conversation about wanting to do something different felt like it was basically asking for a divorce.
Mm,
And so I felt very trapped within the constraints that I actually myself had unwittingly signed up for, that I couldn't figure out a way to have the conversation where the conversation wasn't going to mean I want to have a divorce, because I really wanted to stay with her. I just wanted to be myself. I wanted to figure out a way, how could I hold on to this important relationship with her, but also, kind of not have to lop off this whole part of my identity.
yeah. But also, I mean, at the time, going back in time, it was safe for you too to feel like, that you had this monogamous relationship. But then, the culture changes, times change. The scare around AIDS certainly diminishes
Right.
over time. So, with that sort of environmental, cultural change, you're seeking a change in the marital arrangement. So how did those conversations progress? Once it was suggested, hey, maybe think about an open relationship. Did that take time to, I don't want to say convince her, because you're not trying to do a sales job on her, but you're trying to have kind of come to some kind of an agreement.
Yeah, no, I was very much not wanting to do a sales job on this, because that would just fill into too many cultural tropes and stereotypes. I think that the counselor in the book, the name for the counselor is Lene. Lene suggested an open arrangement. We talked about it, and we basically decided, let's do this as an experiment. Let's see. We're already sort of heading for divorce, but let's see if we can take this detour. Let's see if we could make some kind of an open arrangement work for ourselves. And then if it doesn't work, you can call it quits then, right? And we were both on pretty amicable terms at that point. I never wanted to cause her any trouble, so I said, I will give you this a very friendly divorce if it doesn't work out. But I just let's give it one last try. Let's see if we can make this work. We live in Portland, Oregon, which is a pretty socially progressive environment. So as soon as we kind of self-identified as people going down that path of non-monogamy, we found other people pretty quickly, found other people who were doing the same thing. And so you could find fellow travelers who had maybe some people who were farther along on the path and had ideas about how do you navigate it. Because you kind of have to, like, if you're in a monogamous arrangement, they give you the rules. You get the rules, you get the agreements. There's no discussion. You just do it right the way they give it to you. With non-monogamy, there's no script, there's no path that's blazed really. You have to kind of you have to figure out what's going to work for you. And so there's a lot of conversation to come up with agreements. What are the guardrails that are going to keep our relationship safe while we also pursue things outside the relationship?
So, how important was it to have that community, that sort of group of people around you as you're navigating this sort of new territory?
It was super important, and there were a number of different times. And these are in the book. There were a number of times where people in our community gave us guidance and advice or suggested we do certain things to make it more equal, egalitarian, effective. Um, yeah. So yeah, it was super super helpful because you're kind of in the dark if you're just going by just yourselves. Because we had no role models. I didn't know anybody. I growing up, I'd never known any buddy who'd been in an open relationship. I knew marriages where people had had affairs. I knew what that looked like, and that did not look good. But I didn't know what it looked like when there was kind of a openly consensual non-monogamous arrangement. Like what does that kind of look like when two adults pursue it in a spirit of respect and care?
And it sounds like you've been successful with this arrangement. I'm curious, like what are the keys to success with an arrangement like this? Because you're learning the rules as you go along. Like
Yeah.
nothing is prescribed. What really helped it to work?
I think the first thing I would say, so the interesting thing is, like, since I started publishing essays about this. I'm a psychotherapist, as my that's the job I do to pay the bills. And so since I started publishing in this area, publishing essays, a lot of the clients who've come to me are in these kinds of arrangements. So one of the things I know is that there's just like so many different ways of doing it. There's no one prescribed path. Um, and so the way that we did it is not necessarily prescriptive or representative for anybody, but we did it in such a way. We really put a lot of premium on protecting our relationship, making sure that we honored our own time together. um, this was not a just staying together for the kids kind of arrangement. We still loved each other, and we wanted to make sure that we kind of kept that focus clear. um, yeah. We did not bring people home to our house. We kept our family house was the place where we raised our kids and had our family, and so we kind of kept the world separate that way, and that kind of made it feel a little bit safer to us. Not everybody does it that way, but so definitely in the time period of the memoir, that was what helped us for it to feel safe.
Yeah. So it's not like a situation where, like a swinging lifestyle thing where you're introducing each other to new partners and playing together. It more of a kind of
No,
keeping those areas, sort of those other relationships or interactions completely separate.
I would say not completely separate. I mean, not completely separate. I mean, we did. If she was seeing someone who was important to her, I I eventually did make it my business to meet that person and to be on friendly terms with them, and vice versa. So we did integrate our other partners into our lives, but we just did it in a really careful, thoughtful way. And it wasn't what is sometimes referred to as kitchen table polyamory, where, boyfriends and girlfriends are coming to dinner and everybody's sitting down and having feasting together and stuff like that. Partly because we had three little kids. And so it was a very busy household with lots of stuff going on. And there's enough going on just with three kids, and just trying to navigate all the different developmental stages that they're at.
Sure. Did you have ground rules around any of this? I mean, in terms of always kind of being upfront and communicating when you're going out seeing somebody, or I'm just curious as to like if there were like rules involved.
Rules, I don't. I would say it was as prescriptive as rules. We had certain agreements, and definitely when we were starting, we had certain agreements that it helped us both to feel safer doing this. um we were clear and communicative with each other about when we were going out, with whom we were going out, when we would be home, the predictable stuff, right? um yeah, we had to have agreements around what we called reentry. When you come back from a date to your spouse who has been home with kids, maybe, you're in very different psychological spaces, and figuring out how much what level of transparency do we want in terms of talking about what our evenings were both like. So we had to have sort of rules about how much were we going to talk about what each other were doing outside the home.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you mentioned kids a few times. I mean, did they pick up on sort of what this sort of new arrangement was, or this lifestyle was?
We did tell them. um we definitely tell them and kind of kept them in the loop as appropriate to their kind of developmental ages and stuff like that. um so yeah, but the interesting thing is they don't really care. Like, I mean, kids really do not care about their parents' sex lives. They just so like, like they knew there were other people in our lives, but they didn't have any other status other than like our friends would have had. It really wasn't, because kids, again, kids are more focused on, sort of what are you doing for them and what are we doing together as a family, and um not so much what does dad do when he's outside the house, what does mom do when she's outside the house.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think we think kids think a little bit more about those aspects of our lives than they really do.
Well, it's interesting. Like, one of the most common questions I'm asked, both like in interviews, but also by like friends and family, is, "Oh my gosh, how is this impacting the children?" And the disappointing news is the children could care less. The children are just like not particularly, paying attention. As they got older, I will say that as our kids got older, and they're in their 20s now, but as they got older in their teen years, I think they thought it was interesting. And when we did talk about it, mostly they thought it was interesting, and they didn't want us to do anything different because it made us more interesting amongst their peers.
Right. But also, I mean, there's I think an inherent bias in that question, which is, oh my gosh, you're doing something that's so out of the norm, it's going to negatively impact, these kids that you're raising. However, what would be a more negative impact is if you and your spouse, your partner, were living in misery. You know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's something really powerful for kids, having parents who are living very honestly. Because this arrangement allowed me to be open as a queer man who happened to be heterosexually partnered, and that ended up being really valuable when my daughter was 13 and she came out. Because she had a safe person in the family that she could do that with. And so we don't know, like, all the various ways in which we can impact our kids just by living honestly, being true to who we are.
Yeah. How did you come up with the title, The Maps That Gave Us?
There's a really beautiful um series of love sonnets that the lesbian poet Adrienne Rich wrote in her book The Dream of a Common Language, the 21 love poems. And there's a line from one of the poems, and it's about coming together in a relationship with a woman during a time that was hostile to that idea, right? And so the line is, "Whatever we do together is pure invention. The maps they gave us were out of date by years." Um, yeah, so this idea of, like, we have to make it up as we go, if we want something that's going to kind of fit us as we truly are.
All right. And you're of course giving your kids different maps.
Yeah, yeah,
different
yeah.
different topography.
Yeah. Well, I think the other meaning for me of kind of the maps they gave us is, I mean, what my memoir's about, non-monogamy, is it's not a particularly original idea. Like, I mean, it's not this is not the first time it's been done. And there's a lot, if you go deeply into queer and feminist literature over the ages, you see lots of people grappling with the orthodoxies that go along with heterosexuality and intimacy. And so throughout my memoir, I'm reading different queer and feminist authors, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, D.H. Lawrence, Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, who themselves were grappling with the maps and grappling with different ways of doing things. Um, and so, yeah, there's other meanings of maps. We have our ancestors. We have other people who blazed paths. So we're really not starting from scratch. We just have to find them, right? We just have to be willing to kind of seek them out.
Right. Yeah, because they are there. You just have to do
Hmm.
a little digging. Um, I'm curious. So, what advice to um, and like a heteronormative couple would you give? To kind of what could heteronormative couples learn from your experience and this memoir?
I think that I think that one of the unfortunate parts of the script that we get about what marriage is supposed to look like is that it's very either or. It's very much a binary. You either have a good marriage or you have a pathology and you need to get divorced. And I think it makes it hard for marriages that go through rough periods of struggle, when people may be redefining themselves. It's hard to just sort of like figure out a new way of being together as opposed to just quickly going to divorce. I think we live in a world that doesn't have a lot of tolerance for people floundering around and looking for their ways of adapting, creatively adapting, to changes. Um, so I guess the memoir that takes place over the course of like a year and a half to 2 years, when the couple, my wife and I, are trying to sort it out, and it's a long, painful, liminal period. Like where we're struggling, we're trying to figure out what we're going to do, and so I guess one thing I'd hope couples take from it is patience. Be patient with yourself, and you don't have to rush towards any one supplied solution about how you get to a better place. There are lots of different options for how people can be together.
Yeah, and
And
I
and
think
also that divorce doesn't deserve the stigma it gets, because divorce really should just be another transition.
right. Right, but it also doesn't have to be, the only solution you look at. To your point, it doesn't necessarily have to be a binary thing.
Yeah.
Because if you think about long-term relationships, and I've known my wife since 1992. I mean, we
Mhm.
we we met in freshman year of college, and that was a long time ago. And the two of
Yeah.
us, um, we started off as friends. It's uh but we both changed. I'm not the same person I was when I was 18 years old. I'm 50 years
Right.
old now. It's like I'm a completely different person. My interests have evolved, as have hers.
Right.
And we don't look the same, we don't act the same. But you almost have to think about loving the person who they're becoming, not
Hmm.
not always the person who they were when you met. And
Absolutely.
that's a tricky thing without communication and without sort of understanding and patience.
Yeah. I think that's a key word that you used right there, is becoming, is having the containers for our relationship be places where that allow for a lot of growth and becoming and healing. That there's room for movement, that you don't have to kind of fit into a rigid prescribed mold. You don't have to stay the person you were at 24, 25, 26 whenever you got married. There's room to grow and change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. It's like I look at myself. I have so idealists. I was an idealist at 18, right? Never wanted to be anything like my parents. Then, of course, I become a parent, and then
Right.
I turn into my parents.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
right.
then
No,
because
it's
then
true.
you've got that empathy that you didn't have for them when you were growing up necessarily. And like, oh shit, this is not easy.
No, no, it is not. And parenting changes you. That's one of the big things that changes people. And it's easy to lose yourself when you're parenting. I mean, I don't know how many kids you have, but we had three, and they were pretty close in age. And so, man, it was a busy household for many, many years, chasing after them and all the different activities kids do to kind of keep growing and moving. And yeah, you as a parent, you can kind of lose yourself. You become just a parent. You don't even know who you are anymore.
Yeah, no, it's
Um,
true. We have three,
yeah.
born a minute apart. So we have triplets.
Oh
Um,
wow. Oh my
so
God. Okay.
so that was like we were put into, and I was young. I was like 27, I think, when they were born. so I went from, 0 babies to 3 babies in 3 minutes, basically. And, between that and then, trying to grow a career and earn a living, lots of things get thrown at you, lots of stress and pressures. And, it's, none of it's easy.
Yeah.
None of it's easy. And, but, I guess you just figure out a way through it, but it does change. It absolutely changes you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's like, I mean, it's not even just about, non-monogamy is not even the only change. I mean, sometimes couples decide, for example, they want to live separately but still be married, or sometimes people decide, the big one I always see in my practice with couples is people decide they want to keep their finances separate because they manage money differently. There's just like lots of different ways of growing and evolving your relationship to make it fit as you change as you change.
Yeah. I'm curious about that T-shirt. So many books, so little time.
This is actually, I have my collector hobby is T-shirts from bookstores all over places that I've been, and so this one's from Politics and Prose, and I think, is it Woody Guthrie that said so many books, so little time? But that's how it feels at my house. I mean, my house is like teeming with books. I don't know what to do with it. There's like cracked books all over the place because it's just one of my passions.
Yeah. No, very good. Well, I think the key to being a good author is being a good reader.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
I'm curious, Wayne, if you had any words of advice for an aspiring author, maybe somebody who wants to start penning their memoir, what would you tell them?
I think writing a memoir is a very healing, creative, and sometimes inspiring process. I think it's better than journaling. When you're journaling, you're just kind of putting it down on paper for yourself. When you're writing a memoir, you're trying to make the same material into art. It's not really a documentary anymore, it's art. And there's something really profound and moving and integrative about that. I think one of the hazards of trying to be a writer and maybe wanting to do something commercial with it, like publish a book, is that the closer you get to the industry, the book publishing industry, the scarier, the more problematic. Like, you're entering into a realm that's defined by competition and haves and have-nots, and it can really diminish the creative part of the work, which feels so generative and alive and about beauty, right? And so for me, it's like I have to be really intentional when I'm moving into that realm where we're talking about publishing stuff, whether it's essays or books or things like that, because it can compromise how you feel about it. So one of the things I would say is, like, don't get too preoccupied with the publishing world. Like, write the thing you're supposed to write.
Right. And don't be worried about the rejection that's going to come along with it, because
Oh
it
yeah,
will
it's like
come.
ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Like, I mean, you really have to have an incredibly tough skin to be a writer, because it's a rejection all over the place.
No, yeah, it's a industry of rejection.
Yep.
Wayne, I'm sure we've piqued some people's interest here. Where can people go to learn more about you? Do you have a website or any social media that you're active on?
Yeah. Yeah. It's all listed it's all on my website, which is waynescottwrites.com. And that's where you can get the book. And it also lists all the different places that where I'm in Blue Sky, Facebook, all Insta, all the traditional places writers are, Substack. Now, yeah, lots of places.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to put all those links in our show notes. And Wayne, I'll say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.